Good afternoon and evening, everyone, and welcome to Stamp Talks presented by the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada. Tonight, we have with us Chris McFetridge guiding us through collecting modern issues and modern Canada. Chris worked on and off in the stamp trade from 1988 to 2004, and in 2010 started Brixton Chrome Incorporated, an online stamp auction house that features weekly themed auctions. First on a part-time basis, but eventually he left his accounting career behind to focus entirely on philately. Chris has some interesting talks available on YouTube under the Brixton Chrome name, and he is also a current director of the RPSC. And if you meet Chris at a stamp show, I will all but guarantee that you will have a very enjoyable chat. We would like to thank Longley Auctions, our sponsor for Stamp Talks and Stamp Panels. Longley Auctions is a public auction firm specializing in selling Canadian material, particularly postal history, worldwide collections, stamps, postal history, postcards, and philatelic literature. Be sure to check out longleyauctions.com. And now we will have our land acknowledgement.
Many other organizations in Canada, the Board of Directors of the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada has chosen to acknowledge Indigenous peoples in Canada with the following statement. As a step towards reconciliation, the RPSC acknowledges that our national office in Toronto stands on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our national office is also covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. Furthermore, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples did not give up the lands that they had been on for thousands of years that now constitute Canada. We also acknowledge that Europeans did not discover Canada or arrive on an uninhabited land. The RPSC acknowledges that Canada is covered by many treaties and modern lands, resources, and self-government agreements with Indigenous peoples, and that the provisions of many of these arrangements remain unfulfilled. The RPSC further acknowledges that many Indigenous peoples in Canada have not had their rights fully recognized and implemented according to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The RPSC pledges to promote recognition and knowledge of Indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere and their cultures through philately. We will also work towards building positive relationships with Indigenous peoples in Canada.
All right, thanks, Greg. And without further ado, we pass the time over to Chris.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about collecting modern Canada. I'm quite excited to give this talk. I will say that pretty well anything tonight about Canada could probably be applied to any post-war country that you care to collect. In defining modern for Canada, I'm basically taking it to be the beginning of the Elizabethan period up to current time. That's different from some people's definition, but that's the one that I use when I speak of modern stamps. So what I have for you tonight is an 18 slide presentation. I'm going to start by talking about the appeal of modern stamps. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about the differences between modern philately and classic philately, because I do believe that they are two different hobbies in a sense. Then I'll talk about the points of interest that I feel stand out for modern philately, and particularly Canadian stamps, and I'll go through each one. I'll talk a little bit about the tools that I think are essential to have if you're going to form a specialized modern collection. And then I'll talk about some of the decisions in terms of scoping that you're going to want to make before you embark on forming a specialized modern collection. And I'll conclude with an example of what that might look like if I were to decide to form a modern collection and how I would go about scoping it out. So getting into the appeal of modern issues, I got 6 points. So one is the challenge of acquisition is balanced with affordability. And by that, I mean that about 95% of the modern stamps are readily affordable to most of the people listening to this talk, if not everybody. And then there's that last 5% that offers the challenge of scarce and rare items. Fortunately, most of them are errors. There's a small number of regular issue stamps that are in the $500 to $1,000 range, but it's fairly minimal and it's very manageable. The second is identification requires immense skill and patience. So the differences between modern varieties on modern stamps and varieties on classic stamps are much, much smaller. And oftentimes you'll get stamps that will look at first glance to be exactly the same as one another. And it takes a great deal of patience sometimes and experience to be able to tell that they're actually. It's much more subtle than classic philately, I find. And so it really requires a lot of experience as a philatelist, I think, to pursue it at a very deep level. The third point, variations are discrete and limited, and almost all of them have significance. So what I mean there is with classic philately, a lot of times there's small, minute variations in colors or paper that can be quite voluminous to the point where you can be sorting a pile of 200 stamps and you could sort them into 50 piles or more, in fact. And so at a certain point, the significance of the varieties comes into question. Whereas with modern stamps, that same pile might only be sorted into 2 or 3. And sometimes no piles except for one. You know, you can have issues where you've got 100 stamps and they're all identical and there's no difference between them. So it's much more controlled as far as the number of varieties. There's an opportunity for almost unlimited new discoveries because so much of the period has gone unstudied. And part of the reason for that is that most of the attention in studying is focused on mint stamps. And given that most stamps are used, and in the case of a lot of definitives, up to about 95% of the original issue was used, you can't really get a full picture for what existed unless you look at used stamps as well. And there isn't a whole lot done on a lot of modern used stamps because they're so inexpensive. But it's essential to study them if you want to form a complete picture of the issues you're looking at. Nearly all the key pieces that are in Canadian philately from the Elizabethan period, they're almost all still intact, or they still exist and are obtainable. That's changing as more and more material is used up for postage, but there's still enough of it around that you can generally obtain it if you want it. But that's not the case with, say, the small queens or the admirals, where a lot of material just simply doesn't exist anymore. There's fantastic richness with postal history. We've got numerous rate changes of services such as signature mail, special delivery, second and third class mail, householder rates, and so on. There's many other services other than the ones I've named that came and went over the last 30 years. And then, of course, there's the challenges. Oh, I got a little typo there. The challenges afforded by setenants and souvenir sheets. Tremendously challenging to find used in period on cover. So there's just a huge opportunity if you're a postal historian and you've got the patience of a saint to go through dealers' cover boxes and try to form an in-period collection of covers. I dare say that it would be almost impossible to get everything. If not, require years and years of decades of patient searching of the modern period. Now, I believe that there's a difference between classic philately and modern philately, and I believe it lies largely in the types of varieties and where the focus tends to be for serious philatelic study. So classic philately usually focuses on varieties that arose due to technological limitations of the printing processes, such as reentries, major shades, paper varieties that are very obvious, and due to the manufacture of the paper, um, perforations due to breakdown and repair of machinery, or with experimentation aimed at preventing fraudulent reuse. So watermarks largely were a security measure to prevent forgery. The introduction of engraving or the widespread adoption of engraving was another. Most varieties studied in classic philately are usually quite obvious to the naked eye. You can see most of them without a loop. Sometimes you might need a loop to see a few very subtle reentries of varieties, but most things a fairly inexperienced collector with a perforation gauge or a watermark tray can identify. Modern philately, instead, is the study of variations that arise from deliberate decisions made to experiment with papers, tagans, and inks. And a lot of it has to do with the desire to mechanize the sorting and canceling process and to increase the efficiency and production of stamps to make everything cheaper. And I mean, a lot of the differences that we'll get into that you'll see in Canada, particularly during the 60s, a lot of that is intentional. And very brief experiments that were made, phased out new with papers and with inks and with new and gum and other things, and new things tried. And there was a tremendous period of experimentation between about 1962 and 1976. Whereas later in Canadian philately from the 1980s to the 1990s, a lot of the varieties arise due to bankruptcies with the paper suppliers. But anyway, those are the main differences. And then because of this, most of the varieties that are significant in modern philately are either not readily visible to the naked eye. A lot of them require ultraviolet light to identify, or they require a loop that has a magnification. I can't tell you the number of constant varieties I've found on modern stamps where I missed them before because I wasn't using a loop to look at the stamps, expecting them to jump out at me, and they just didn't. But once I start looking at the stamps under magnification, I can see them very readily. Modern printing is incredibly precise, whereas classic printing is not. So with classic stamps, like I said, like number 37 or number 41, 3-cent small queen, you can sort 1,000 stamps and wind up with 100 different shades of orange and vermilion. Due to the very tiny variations that are just a function of things like the humidity and room temperature in the plant on the day that they mix the ink, or small quantities of pigment variation. With modern stamps, it's all computerized, and so those same 1,000 stamps may yield you only a couple of varieties, or maybe nothing at all. So therefore, modern varieties that on classic stamps would be considered small or insignificant are actually a very big deal. And this, I believe, is why most of them are not listed in a lot of the standard catalogs, because the editors are using the same standards that they're applying to classic stamps to judge the significance of the modern varieties. And so a lot of the modern varieties aren't, in their minds, making the cut, which I think is a mistake for all the reasons I've explained. So what are some of the areas of interest in modern philately or in modern Canada specifically? Well, I've identified 8 main ones. We've got paper fluorescence and paper types, tagging and fluorescent coatings, gum, so specifically the replacement of dextrin with PVA gum after failed adoption of invisible Davik gum, which occurred very briefly in 1966. Constant varieties, postal history, correct in-period use of attendance and souvenir sheets, new materials for stamps, so now cloth, plastic, and so forth. I don't think we've done plastic yet, but oh yes, we have. No, we have. We've got the puck stamp. So we've had at least 2 other materials other than paper. Self-adhesives, die cutting varieties. So I guess the modern equivalent to perfs, but they're measured and described completely differently, and they use a different scale to identify. And then, of course, perforation varieties, which are found all throughout the Elizabethan period, but are more concentrated in some periods than others. Okay, so getting into the paper fluorescence and paper types, type refers to the manufacturer. So for most of the pre-1971 stamps, it's the E.B. Eddy company, certainly for the centennial issue. I'm not terribly clear on the early 1950s and late 50s, but I assume that it's the same company. But somebody here might be able to correct me there. Abitibi becomes the main supplier in the Ashton Potter period in the 1970s, and continues on until its bankruptcy in 1982-83. Then in 83, we see the introduction of Harrison Clark papers. Roland paper appears in 1985. Peterborough paper appears in 1990. And then Coated Papers paper, which later becomes TRC, appears in 1992, actually. And then Fasten and Jack. Now, Fasten is a later paper from the 2000s on the definitives. Jack paper appears, I think, for the first time on the greeting stamps from 1994. Fluorescence is measured, at least at the moment, by specialists on a 1 to 12 point scale that Erwin Freeman came up with in the 1960s. That scale where 0 is dead and 1 to 2 is dull fluorescent, 3 to 4 is low fluorescent, 5 is fluorescent, 6 to 7 is medium fluorescent, 8 to 9 is high fluorescent, and 10 to 12 is high bright. So you can see within that scale, each of the main groups of fluorescence actually occupy 2 or maybe 3 points on that scale, because there are differences within each of them. That's a very daunting topic for a lot of people. I will admit it takes a long time to gain proficiency and experience at telling apart the intermediate levels between, say, 3 and 8. The ends of the scale are not too difficult for most people, but it's something that you just have to work at over time, and you just um, you compare and contrast with your ultraviolet light, and eventually you get more comfort the more you work on it. I will say that I think one scale is probably not adequate for pre 1967 and the post 1998 stamps. So the reason is fluorescence levels are very, very low for those two periods. Yet there are variations that still exist and should probably be studied. So I think actually what would be good would be to come up with separate scales for each of those three periods and have the Irwin-Freeman scale be sort of in the middle between 1967 and about 1998. But to come up with something for the other two ends to deal with differences that are just not captured by this scale here. I have a concept of ambient fluorescence versus fluorescent flex. And what I mean by that is that sometimes what you'll see when you're looking at stamps under the ultraviolet light is you'll see fluorescent flecks or fibers in the stamps that are making the overall fluorescence look brighter than it really is. So the ambient fluorescence is the inherent fluorescence in the paper without the flex. If you were to ignore what you're seeing, the inclusions that you're seeing in the paper, and you just look at the overall fluorescence without those. And then the presence of those flecks raises the overall fluorescence up to the perceived level that you're seeing. That's getting very, very, very in the weeds, and that's very advanced, and probably beyond the scope of probably most collectors. But if you're intent on getting highly specialized, this will be one way to clarify the subject of fluorescence and make it easier to understand, if not more complicated. And then the significance of fluorescence. Why do we have these differences? Well, I think it has to do mostly with paper recycling and optical brighteners added to re-whiten, uh, post-recycled fiber, I think. Because now most papers are not fluorescent at all, but there was this very brief period, 20-year period or so, where we had lots of variation. So that's it for all I have for paper fluorescence. Now, tagging and fluorescent coatings. Winnipeg tagging was introduced in January 1962. It was replaced by Ottawa tagging in 1972. And so the Winnipeg, there's different types of tagging, different configurations of bars, different intensities. The Ottawa tagging that replaces it also has variations that you'll see at the bottom here. Fluorescent coated paper was used in 1995 to 97, just briefly. And then we went back to Ottawa tagging after that brief period with the fluorescent coated paper. Winnipeg tagging was phosphorescent, which means it shows up best under shortwave ultraviolet light. It was 1 and 2 bar tags applied to the sheets. Either go down the center of the stamps or they would go down the perforations, causing a stamp to have a bar on each side. Now, you can see it with regular long wave ultraviolet lights, but it's not nearly as bright. And I point out to people that if you actually view it under shortwave light, it glows very, very bright electric blue. Whereas under long wave light, it just looks bluish white, and sometimes it's actually very hard to see it. The Ottawa tagging was initially 2 bars, and then 4 bars starting in late 1985. And it's now 4 bars is pretty well the standard all the way around the design. The initial Ottawa tagging that came out in 1972 was migratory, uh, which meant it was unstable, and it actually moved through um, all the stamps in its vicinity, booklet covers, album pages, whatever. And so you'll sometimes come across stamps from the caricature issue. And for some of the commemoratives that came with Ottawa tagging, where when you lamp them, they appear to be sort of a bright yellow all throughout the stamp. And what that is the entire tag has migrated across the surface of the stamp. Sometimes you'll see no migration, but the tag will just have faded out into just about nothing and will be a very light bluish white. It's now been about 50 years plus since those tags were introduced. So most of whatever was going to happen in terms of migration will have already occurred. So it's not the warnings you see in the catalogs about containing the material, I think, are probably not as crucial now as they were. So that's tagging. Gum. So early Elizabethan issues to 1971 are with dextrin gum. The gum still varies, though. Even though it's dextrin, there's still varieties you can find in terms of smooth versus streaky appearance and the level of sheen that it has. So you know whether it's very glossy, sort of a semi-gloss, or a satin-like sheen. That I think has some significance because it speaks to either the method of application or chemical differences in the makeup of the gum that give it a different finish when it dries. And you know what the significance is, I think, is a topic for actual study, but it's definitely visible, and I think that there's probably something to it. There was an invisible Davic gum that appears in only 2 issues from 1966 and 67, and it was not adopted more widely. I think probably because it didn't stick very well, and I think it also it was so invisible, it just didn't look like the stamps had any gum. So it just did not take off. In 1971, the first synthetic gum appears, which is referred to as spotty white gum in the centennial issue. It's almost a hybrid of PVA and dextrin. It appears on only a handful of stamps issued in 1971, and then it just disappears and it doesn't come back. Again, I'm not really sure why. It looks like it was a pretty effective gum, but it just didn't persist. PVA gum first appears in late 1971, and there's tons and tons of variety of PVA gum. If you look at it very closely, you'll see there's differences in thickness of how thick the gum is, what the surface sheen is, what the color is. Even on the same issue, you'll see differences if you look closely enough on some issues, especially the centennials. Okay, then we get into constant and tertiary varieties. Now, constant varieties. So prior to 1970 Christmas issue, the stamp layouts were typically 4 or 6 panes of 50 or 100. So between 1 and 600 subjects. Once Ashton Potter appears on the scene, a number of proprietary layouts of up to 10 panes make up the layouts. And the information on what those layouts were, a lot of it has died with the people who worked at Ashton Potter. It was a private company, so they were not obligated to disclose anything about their production. And so a lot of what they did is somewhat of a mystery. A number of varieties that appear that are specific to particular position on every pane, which is a constant variety, or on only one pane in the layout. or say every second or every third pane, which we refer to as a tertiary variety. The best examples of issues that had a lot of constant varieties, but some of which are very, very scarce, and some combinations are scarce, are the 1970 Christmas issue, in which there've been over 1,000 constant varieties identified, and the 1972 Kreekhoff issue, where there's over 30 varieties that have been found on the 6 panes, and some of those occur on only one of the 6 panes in one position. So in every 300 stamps. Now, the significance of the constant varieties and what makes them collectible is the fact that they're constant and that they're specific to a position. And that creates some scarcity. So for instance, if you're looking for a tertiary variety on the Kreekhoff issue on a tagged stamp, you're contending with the fact that only a small percentage of that printing was tagged. And now you're looking at one in every 300 stamps. So even if you were to have a pile in front of you of 300 mint stamps, it doesn't mean that you're going to find that variety. You may look through them and not find it at all. You basically have a 1 in 300 chance of finding it each time you look at a stamp. So, there is some actual challenge involved in trying to find a number of the varieties, but also just trying to ascertain whether they are constant or whether they are tertiary is a great challenge, because in order to demonstrate constancy, you have to be able to, and that's very difficult to do. It's much easier to prove that something's tertiary, but even still, trying to nail down whether it's how many panes it occurred on in the layout requires you to have access to a very large number of sheets and to do a fairly detailed study on it. So, I mean, the constant varieties in modern are every bit as significant as any of the major varieties in, say, the 1930s period, like the burr on the shoulder of the Cartier, or the broken leg on the Mountie, or any of those. But they just seem like most people think they're just fly specks because they appear to be so insignificant. Um, Admittedly, most of the 1,000 varieties on the Christmas issue are probably not that significant, but they are constant, and there are sheets that you can find that will have some combinations of varieties on them, and then other ones that won't will have a different combination. And so there's a bit of a puzzle there, and that is a whole other area that you can really get into. Postal history. Okay, so as I said in the introduction, we've had near annual rate increases starting in 1982. The attendants are such, when you look at them, that a block or a pair does not usually correspond to a particular first class rate, which makes it a challenge to find it properly used on cover in period. Because usually doing so would result in an overpaid cover if it was used just for the basic first class rate. And so usually what you're looking for much of the time, if you want a properly paid cover in period, is you're looking for a registered cover with a combination of stamps, or to a foreign destination, or with an extra service. And that's not easy to find. Some rates are very short-lived, such as early 1979, just before Canada Post went metric. So before they went from ounces to grams, or in late 1976 to early 1977, when the rate was 10 cents and went up to 12 cents in less than 6 months. All the other rates, special delivery, registered, all of them went up in step as well. So getting, actual covers, registered covers from that 6-month period is a little harder than you might think. And so real challenges to get all of them on cover in the proper period. Perforation varieties. Most collectors know Elizabethan stamps to be perf 12 or 12.5 by 12 until 1974, when 13.3 appears. But there are many other variations after that. Issues to 1962 actually can be found perf 12, 11.95, 12.15, and compounds thereof. Julian Goldberg and his colleagues have discovered the introduction of the 11.85 gauge in 1962, which they wrote about in the Canadian Philatelist. And thereafter up to the end of line perforating in late 1971. It's the more common measurement, though 11.95 is still found in combination with 11.85. So this opens up a whole area of studying perforations that you can do from 1962 certainly to 1971 on every issue, and looking for basically 4 perforation measurements at least on every issue, and you can find them, and some of them are scarcer than others. To do it, you need an Instanta gauge, which I'll get into at the end here, but it's definitely an area that's, I think, fairly interesting. Requires a lot of patience to measure them properly, but it's doable. Perforating switches from line to comb in late 1971. And then different configurations of perforating are found in the early 70s on sheets where perfs will stop just short of the selvage. So a particular column will stop at the bottom row or at the top row exactly, or it will extend one hole into the selvage, which we call one extension hole past the row or column, or it'll go all the way through, so selvage perforated through. If you look in Unitrade, you'll see under the different Christmas issues, I believe from 1972 and 75, and the Maple Leaf and Four Seasons in 1971, that all of those issues exist with different configurations of perforation in the selvage, and some of them are quite scarce. But of course, you need the actual selvage pieces to prove which are which. In 1988 to 91, the mammals set, we see the appearance of unannounced perforation changes that have become rare today. So now we've looked at the different areas of interest. The tools needed to study modern Canadian stamps, an ultraviolet light is a must. One with dual short and long wave would be best, but a good 18-inch black light from Canadian Tire will do. It's long wave only, but it will work for 90% of what you want to do. I find they typically, at least for me, they don't last longer than a couple of years because they start to burn out. But for a collector who's only using it once every week or every couple of weeks, it should last for years. It'll work in a lit room because of its size. So I find it's pretty good. I mean, I myself right now use a 70s dual model that I found in a collection I bought, and it's great. And I'll use it till it burns out. But then after that, I probably have to go back to the 18-inch light. You'll need an Instanta perf gauge, which is it's a gauge with the number of lines on it, like this, and it can measure to 0.05 of a perf. And it's what enables you to do the very detailed studies that I talked about. A good 10 power loop, just like this, can have a light in it or not, just something that allows you to magnify up close to see those constant varieties. Okay, so now coming down to the end of the talk in the next couple of minutes, you're going to have to make some decisions when you're forming the collection as to scope, as to format, as to degree of detail, and whether you want to be a closed or an open-ended collector. So for scope, that's obvious. That's really whether the period you want to choose. Like, do you want to collect the entire Elizabethan period, or do you want to limit yourself to a specific time period? Do you want to include mint or used? Both, one or the other. Format, you've got to decide, are you doing singles, plate blocks, first day covers, postal history, or are you doing them all? Decisions as to degree of detail. So going through the different areas of interest that I've identified, you may decide, well, look, I want to do some paper fluorescence, but I really only want to do, of the 12, I just want to do 3 or 4 or 5, and eliminate the more complicated ones. And then closed versus open-ended collecting. Do I want to define what my collection is and be rigid, which is a closed-ended collecting, or do I want to be open-ended and just take anything that comes along that's different from what I already have that fits into my general theme of what I want to do? So I'll close with an example of what my decisions would look like if I was forming a collection. Okay, so for scope, I'd collect the whole Elizabethan period to her death, starting in 1952. Singles, I would include one of every variety I could find, collected in a very open-ended manner. So the singles would be my focus, and the singles I would collect, no holds barred, everything I could find. Plate blocks, I would want to get a representative collection of blocks or pairs to illustrate the inscription. But beyond that, I really wouldn't care about trying to replicate what I had gotten in the singles. So I wouldn't care which variety I had. I wouldn't care which position I had. I mean, up to 1956, I'd probably go for lower left because it has the full order number on the inscription, and it's more detailed than on the other positions. But after that, it really doesn't matter. It can be any of the 4. And in fact, after that, I don't even really need a block. I can go for a pair, because a pair will give you the full inscription in most cases. And I only need one. The first day covers, again, for me, one of each would be fine. It could be any cachet, any configuration of stamps, as I just really want one representative cover for each issue. I'm not trying to form a specialized first day cover collection, so I wouldn't be getting into dozens of different cachets for each issue. That would be something for a first day cover collector. Postal history, I would try to get one commercial in period usage of each issue. Okay, again, destination specific rate would not be important, as again, I'm not trying to form a specialized cover collection. I just want to illustrate one of each stamp. Cancellations on used stamps. I would like to get a page of cancels from as many towns as I could find. So what I would do if I was laying out an album is I'd make a facing page for a particular town with a couple of picture postcards of that town, maybe a small 1 to 2 paragraph write-up about the town. And then on the right side, I would have up to 6 to 10 stamps with cancels of that town. And it can be any of the issues of the period. It doesn't have to be more than that. And then I'd move on to the next town. To make it simple, I wouldn't include any errors like inverted centers or imperfs, as I would define it strictly in terms of what a collector could have bought over the counter had they gone to the post office. So in conclusion, the sample collection that I just outlined, and that would take you a whole lifetime to form. I know it seems pretty easy, but and large parts of it would be. The first day covers would be pretty easy to assemble. The plate blocks would be pretty simple. The singles, to a very large degree, would be, although it would probably never be complete. There'd always be something coming up. But the thing that would really be the choke point would be the covers and the cancels. That I don't think if you started today, I don't think you'd finish if you had 40 years to do it. And I mean, the thing is, there's nothing in there I can think of that's over $1,000. 99% of that material is affordable to everybody listening to this right now. It's fully open ended. Each section could be expanded as I found more material I wanted or liked. And it would just provide an endless amount of fun. And with that, I hand it over to everybody for questions.
All right, thanks, Chris. I'm going to take this slightly out of order because I think one leads into the other. You had talked about constant and tertiary varieties. In that case, is tertiary inconstant?
Oh, you mean is a tertiary variety constant? Or is it constant? What I'm sorry, I don't
Is
quite
it
understand.
inconstant?
It is because it only occurs, a tertiary variety occurs regularly, okay, and that it does occur at the same interval within the printing, but it's just not on every sheet. So a good example of a tertiary variety is the tear on the skirt or the dress of on the 1974 6-cent Christmas issue. It lists for quite a lot in Unitrade. I think it's $50 because it only occurs on a very small number of sheets from the printing, and I think it's every fifth or sixth sheet or something. It's a low ratio, so it's one of those varieties where if you have a stack of sheets, you probably don't have it. Right, so which is very frustrating because everybody will go and look at the position that it's supposed to be in and it's not there.
Okay, so then the related question is why weren't inconstant varieties mentioned?
Why aren't they?
Yes.
Oh, like why didn't I talk about like just total freaks?
Yes.
Well, no specific reason actually. I probably should have. I mean, I don't actually have anything against them. I think again, I mean, if I think there could be a very interesting collection formed of just whatever it is that comes up on stamps that you see. Because here's the thing, you don't actually know for sure without an awful lot of study that it is inconstant. And this is what I tried to hint at. Like when I talk about the 1970 Christmas issue having 1,000 constant varieties, you have to think that the print layout had to be massive to produce that many. I still don't really know how it happened because it's not the same. Like if their positions are not the same in all the sheets, so you can have a variety and think it's a freak, and you may discover like years and years and years later, you may find it again, but it just might be that scarce. So this is then so this sort of ties into what I'm talking about when I talk about the thrill of undiscovered of new discoveries in modern philately. There's so much out there that isn't understood because the information wasn't written down, and it was proprietary private firms doing the printing.
Not the next question, but I'm going to suggest you stop the screen share so people can see our faces bigger.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Let me see here.
Okay. And while you're doing that, we had a question. What wavelengths are short and long? But we've had some answers thrown in here. 356 nm. I don't actually know what nm stands for.
Nanometers.
Nanometers. Okay. Nanometers and 274 nanometers are short and long. Thank
I
you,
don't
Garfield.
actually know. That's news to me.
Right.
I just rely, I guess, on, I mean, any black light that you buy, a party black light is going to be long wave, because short wave is incredibly dangerous to your eyes.
Oh, I see.
So it's not anything that you would be dancing to in a discotheque is going to be long wave because it's safe.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Duncan also confirmed shortwave is 254 nanometers. Long wave is 300 to 400 nanometers, not nautical miles. Just so we're all clear on that. What were the two issues with the DAVAC gum, DAVAC gum, in 1966 and 1967?
Traffic safety from 1966, and the 1967 centennial issue before the definitive issue. So the long stamp with the flag sticking into Alaska or Yukon, I guess. Um, yeah, just
All right.
those two.
This one, I think, is in reference to your hypothetical collection.
Yeah.
For FDCs, would you try, for first day covers, would you try to get a whole set on one cover?
I could be. Like I said, I if I was going to include FDCs, because I'm not looking to specialize in them specifically, I wouldn't care whether I had the full set, whether I had a six, or one cover for each single. I probably would prefer the set, just because it would cut down on the number of covers I had, because I'd want to cover it probably in as few covers as I could, since it's not really the main focus of the collection.
Okay, which type of paper would you give a more dead appearance under a UV light? Coated or uncoated non-fluorescent paper, and why? Which type of
Generally,
paper would give a more dead appearance? Coated or
well,
uncoated non-fluorescent?
generally, the coated paper will be deader, because the coating usually, I mean, with very few exceptions, there are sometimes instances where the coating is actually fluorescent, but most of the time the coating deadens the fluorescence quite a lot. It's always duller on the front usually than it is on the back. Now, that I know, one thing I didn't get into in this talk was the fact that the paper fluorescence is often different on the front and the back because of the coatings, and that's a whole other can of worms that you open up in looking at both readings, um, which can be different, and often are. Um, yeah.
All right, the next question. How do you mount self-adhesive stamps in an album? Do you remove the envelope or the paper from the back? If so, how? And I presume this is not a Canadian question.
No, I wouldn't remove the backing paper. Um, I would keep it on. Now, there's a bit of a challenge and a bit of a problem now with the way the booklets are designed. Um, they used to design them with adjacent space between the stamps, so you could cut a single out and still have a border around it. Now they butt the stamps right up against each other, and so it's not really possible to cut a border around them. One thing I've tried, which has had limited success in separating them, certainly, is a razor blade, a very sharp razor blade from the back. But I find it still tends to make a bit of a mess. Um, so I don't know. For me now, I mean, with Canada Post, you can buy everything die cut to shape, which is how they come in the annual packs and in the annual collection, and that, you know gives you a nice stamp on backing paper that you can just put into a mount. which is how I would do it. But yeah, I wouldn't take it off the backing paper because then it's not really. I don't know how you protect the gum in that case. I don't know. Did that
Okay.
answer the question?
I presume so, but I also did assume this was a non-Canadian question because Canadian stamps can still be soaked off just with water. Are
Oh, you're
considered
talking
water
about use
soluble.
stamps.
I'm just assuming it because it says remove from the envelope. How do you remove the envelope?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, you're asking the wrong guy. I don't know anything about soaking self-adhesive stamps. There's
Well,
a guy in
Canadian
my
ones,
stamp club who knows
the
all about
adhesive
it.
is water soluble.
Yeah, and on some countries it's not, and some people use lighter fluid and all kinds of other things. Yeah, but I mean, for me, I mean, what I would do in the case of an envelope is I just cut around the stamp and I
Mhm.
just mount it on piece.
Now I have experimented with Goo Gone. It does work, but it will change the appearance. It gives it a bit of a slight blue hue. So I
Yeah,
don't recommend Goo Gone.
yeah.
I had also tried citrus citrus oil, which I found at Dollarama in the form of this product. It's called Poo Be Gone.
Oh gosh.
Um, it does a halfway decent job if you spray the back of the paper, but it ends up leaving, it's still tacky, so the gum is still there. It's still tacky. It'll take the paper off. So you would have to put something on the back, like a talcum powder. It's not great. We do have a comment here that says in the US, Bestine can be used. It contains heptane N. So there's a couple of things you can try if you can
Heptane.
acquire Bestine. D-limonene is the citrus oil. Goo Gone works, but not recommended. Okay. Next question is not actually a question for Chris. Is there any hope to see a new revision of the Unitrade catalog? I spoke with Robin Harris in the fall. That was the most recent time I'd spoken to him. I think it was November. And his answer at that time was there is no plan for a 2025 Unitrade
Yeah.
and a catalog. And he had heard but denied the rumor that it was going to be produced every other year. Is it possible that someone else could purchase the rights and have him produce it? It's
Well,
possible.
that's a good question because I actually spoke to Gino, who is the owner of Unitrade, about a month and a half ago.
Ooh, your
Uh,
information is more recent than mine.
yeah, well, because I had heard that the business was for sale, and so last year I made some inquiries. I called them and I left a message asking them about it, and then they got back to me and said they had a buyer, but it fell through. So I said to him last month, well, I really hate to see it go out of print. I mean, I'm up to my neck with the auction. I don't even know how I would handle, getting a group together to actually buy it and produce the catalog. But I certainly wanted to keep that door open because they've got a product there that is presumably there's a big data file that they could just somebody can take a hold of and just produce the catalog and make some changes and maybe even produce an online version. Um, so the way we left it was apparently his daughter's going to take it over. That's what he told me. Um, and that he did say there would be a 2025-2026 version that they were going to work on, which will come out next year. Now, whether that happens or not, I don't know. Um, I told him that, I gave him my credentials. I told him that if he wanted help with pricing, because I have all the live auction data from my site, I could provide a lot of input on the actual market prices for stuff if he wanted it, especially for the modern stuff. And he was appreciative of that and said he'd get back to me. And so that's the last I've heard. So I'm not sure exactly what will happen, but I'm currently looking at putting together a group of people who can maybe help keep it going. Whether
Okay,
I
you
can
heard it
succeed
here
at that or
first,
not, I don't
folks.
know. What's that?
It's a big maybe. Nothing is
Yeah,
concrete. Let's not start rumors,
yeah.
however. All right, now I have a question, and I'm actually going to share my screen for my question. It is a very specific question. So I have this coil of the 2020 far and wide stamps. Let me move this out of the way. And throughout this coil, I've got this blue spot on this stamp, and it starts off a darker blue on the left, and it lightens up, and at the end of the coil, it's a lot lighter. It's still there.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do I do with this?
Okay. So this looks like a progressive inking flaw of some type. It's unusual. I mean, you don't see this that often at all on any of these issues. And so is it three successive coil stamps?
It's the entire coil. I've got the whole coil of 100. I haven't used any of them.
Okay, and do they all have it?
It's every 10.
Oh, every 10th stamp.
Every 10th stamp.
Okay, so that's a constant variety. That represents probably 10 is probably one revolution of the printing drum.
I presume so.
So it's happening each time the drum completes a revolution. And it's probably some type of over inking. So that would be of interest to a coil collector, certainly, or anybody specializing would probably want a copy of it. They'd probably want a pair, one that has one that has it, one that doesn't, or a strip. So it would be, I mean, in Unitrade you see different varieties that occur every 10th stamp, and they usually have a premium value. It's not incredibly high, but it's usually 50% up to 100% of the basic stamp price. If it
Okay, I just
occurs
have to
that
figure
regularly.
out now
Yeah.
how to move it into the hands of someone who would like it.
Well, you want, I can put it up. I can put pairs up in my auction and see how they do.
Okie dokie. Well, we'll talk another time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have any other? Ooh, another question has popped up. I think this was a drop of ink on the plate that slowly wore off with successive revolutions of the plate, which is 10 stamps long, and then the gutter. It would not repeat. I think that is a likely description. I mean, I assumed so as well, that after the next coil, there probably it probably wore off and there was no more.
Well, it faded off into almost nothing by the end, right?
Yes, by
Yeah.
the one coil I have, it's almost gone anyway at the end.
Yep. Yeah, that's what it is.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for sharing your experience on modern collecting and the different kinds of, I'm going to call them varieties, even though they're not quite varieties. Collecting modern and modern Canadian issues. Thank you again to Longley Auctions. Visit longleyauctions.com and maybe you will find some goodies there to add to your modern collection. Thank you everyone for joining us, and please remember to join us again next time. We will have our panel up first on the second week of February, and the talk following that. Good night, everyone, and see you then. Stop. Okay, good night.